Howdy. Welcome to Ausgrave Royalty. I am Justin. We're back in here with another video in our season regarding Job and the Archetype of the Apocalypse. And today we'll be talking about Waco and Heaven's Gate. I have a lot of disclaimers to make before we get into this. First, we'll be talking about issues of violence, brainwashing, and self-deletion. So this might be sensitive to some viewers, FYI. Next, I am extremely far from an expert on any of these events. We're going to be moving very quickly. Already, the savvy of y'all have noticed that there's been a lack of introduction, so I'm just moving. Got so much to cover. I'm moving through it as fast as I can. But in that same passion, I've only watched a couple of documentaries on these events and some scattered sources here and there, and then Edinger's comments from the books. So from Archetype of the Apocalypse, he has 2 appendices on Waco and Heaven's Gate. So those will be the sources that I'm using. So please don't take my word for anything. Probably going to get things wrong, but this connection, I think, needs to at least be brought to y'all's attention when speaking about Apocalypse in general. So yeah, please don't take my word for anything. I am a filthy casual. I cannot stress this enough. I put that in my notes. My goal here is just to simply send up the flare, make y'all aware of this connection, and then if y'all want to find out more, go ahead. Also, yeah, this is a bit of an odd disclaimer, but things got really mystical when I started looking into this stuff, the topic of the apocalypse, like working on this season. As soon as I finished writing the scripts of this season and had finished the books recently, what releases on Netflix? A documentary series called Waco, American Apocalypse. You can imagine the chill that went down my spine. I'm like, and now I watched the new Black Mirror yesterday. It's June 18th as I'm filming this. There's a Black Mirror episode about a character that's in a show generated by a quantum computer, and it like replicates and brings into her life familiar things. And it's not exactly the same, but it's just like, is Big Brother watching? Like, I don't know. Am I the main character of this simulation that the Netflix documentary Waco called American Apocalypse, like with that specific subtitle, releases the moment I'm doing this? It was creepy. Reminds me of Jungian synchronicity, right? A lot of things other than that have been happening, but that was like the clearest example. Other stuff I won't get into. It's too mystical, but a lot of coincidences along the way, creepily, eerily. Finally, and least importantly, just a little behind the scenes, as it's June 18th or 19th or whatever I said, I usually record the seasons in bulk, but I procrastinated this episode because I just couldn't make up my mind whether I wanted to do a separate show for each of the events or put all the events in one episode, which I'm now choosing to do. I just went back and forth on it too long. Perfection is the enemy of the good. It's very unlike me to do for that behavior. It's the first time I'm doing like a follow-up episode after having largely concluded a season. But first world problems, right? Anyway, that's just some behind the scenes. And it also made it hard that, like, once I got all of this out of my system, you're kind of like ready for new information, not necessarily still stewing on it, usually. course, all this will always be there. But I was already preparing for the next season, which I'm going to do on Robert Johnson's book collection. And I'm just priming myself for all that. And that made it hard to get back into this energy about the apocalypse and such, to do this filming again. So this was strangely the hardest episode to do, just because I'm most getting in my own way on this one. But anyway, enough behind the scenes. Let's talk about Waco. So I'm 38 years old, and the events of Waco occurred when I was a kid. I didn't really know what was happening. I know I heard the words, but I wasn't familiar with the news story, and my parents didn't really clue me in. I was 8 years old, so born in 85. And what I'm about to, as I mentioned earlier, I watched that Netflix documentary. So I'll be quoting from that, and where we'll talk about Edinger too, and I'll differentiate where I'm getting what source when I'm quoting. Speaking of which, the intro to the Netflix documentary says this. It says, in 1993, the U.S. government served a search warrant for machine guns against religious leader David Koresh. What followed was the largest gunfight on American soil since the Civil War, and a 51-day standoff that became the biggest news story in the world. Unquote. So let's do a very quick recap of what we've been talking about this season. First, that the archetype of the apocalypse is felt in an individual when there's an increase in awareness, period. In that vein, ironically, this channel is kind of a servant of the apocalypse, to be melodramatic. Sounds like a metal band or something. But what I'm doing on this channel is creating awareness of connections between big ideas. And to the extent that the ego transforms because of new information is actually an apocalypse, as we've mentioned before. Now, if somebody's world is completely invaded by the unconscious, it is experienced as apocalyptic. And this is what Edinger and Jung have been talking about. Any change in the ego feels like a death because the ego wants to stay put. The second principle is that whatever we fail to make conscious will be acted out unconsciously, and we will call it fate, as Jung says. And I bring that back up yet again, because we're dealing with people that have not made conscious what is possessing them, namely the archetype of the apocalypse. Koresh, and as we'll see, the Heaven's Gate leaders, T and Do, the two, it's as if they are pure archetypal energy. And as the great Robert L. Moore says, from season 2, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, that you never want to be an archetype. Archetypes are a source of incredible power, but they will take over your life and wreak havoc, depending on what archetype it can be. So, we've covered that before, but I just want to keep that kind of thing in mind when we're talking about these events. So getting back to Waco and David Koresh, here's some comments from Edinger. He says, "We have here an illustration of a typical example of the possession of possession by the archetype of the apocalypse. And if one is possessed by that archetype, it inevitably leads to catastrophe, because catastrophe is built into the archetypal pattern. The individual, so possessed, must make it happen in order to fulfill the archetype structure. And that, tragically, is how Vernon Howell, aka David Koresh, came to his fiery death at the age of 34. Right. And like I mentioned, possession usually occurs with people who are especially unconscious, who do not have a lot of awareness of self. Edinger continues, this man represents, instead of sorry, I have a typo. I have a typo when I'm quoting. That's so unprofessional. This man represents a new phenomenon that is a new type of criminal that is quasi-criminal, quasi-psychotic, due to possession by the archetype of the apocalypse. And that means, since a human ego has been bypassed, that the possessed individual is functioning inhumanly. We just talked about that. It is by that very fact a psychological state that generates charisma with tremendous energy in it. Again, archetypes grant you tremendous power, but it comes at the expense of conscious awareness. Hence the term possession. Why do you think like berserkers go into like do dance before like an intense battle to relax or whatever? No, they're literally psyching themselves up for a vicious battle. 1, 2, 3, go team. In sports, you're getting into it. As the great Mickey says, women weaken legs, right? That's archetypal. That's thinking about the warrior archetype. It's from Rocky. And along the way of thinking about all this stuff is the Daedalus Icarus myth, flying too close to the sun, right? You never want to be too close to that archetypal energy. The closer you get, the more your ego burns up. And yet, it's simultaneously life-enriching and pure energy, if we can utilize it. But, ironically, if you try and possess it, it will possess you. So, I'm going to list off, I have some quotes from the documentary. What I'm not going to cover is like the play-by-play of what went down. Please watch the documentary. It's great, at least from a casual observer's perspective, and do your own research on the events. But I'm going to relate some information that applies to the niche that we're exploring here. So, one of the quotes was, if you're living in that world, you're living in another time, as a Davidian, under David Koresh. If you're living in that world, you're living in another time, another place, another dimension entirely. It was a bunch of people that you could tell really loved each other. It was a really caring environment. And they were all in this compound in Waco, living together under David Koresh. And this is from Lee Hancock, a Dallas Morning News reporter, featured in the documentary. Quote, Koresh convinced his followers he was the Christ, he was the Messiah, and that they were the chosen few. They were going to follow him into this fiery ending to the world. Koresh had told them that the apocalypse was going to unfold literally on their front door. He and all of his followers are going to go up in flames and be translated instantly, and then come back with him leading God's avenging army. Lee continues. David Koresh was the child of a teen mom. His stepfather was a convict, a thief. The story was that he was subject to sexual abuse by older boys. And so after he dropped out in middle school, a lady who had befriended him was talking to him one day, and he was asking where he could find people who could help open the Bible up. And the lady said, well, there's this group of people in Waco since that they had been there since the 30s, called the Branch Davidian. And when he came, people there at Mount Carmel said, he was a sort of goofy guy. He was a carpenter. He wasn't very bright. He wasn't very attractive. But he got very close to a woman named Lois Roden. She was the leader of the group. Lois was 67, and Koresh was a young man. And this is a different person in the documentary, Bob. He Koresh seduced Lois. She eventually passed away, and then there was a battle between her son and Koresh for leadership. And after a conflict, David took over. And also, it was mentioned in the documentary that his first girlfriend said that before 1979, he was a long-haired, fun-loving, guitar-playing guy. He smoked pot every once in a while and didn't seek any confrontations with law enforcement. In 1979, he had a nervous breakdown, tremors, convulsions of extremities, under a lot of stress spiritually, and he started having visual and audio hallucinations, primarily at night. And these hallucinations were thinking he was talking to God. And this reminds us of previous episodes when talking about potentially John the Baptist or Ezekiel and the source of the visions of Revelation, visions of Apocalypse. So eventually this compound catches on fire and starts burning up. I'm skipping a disgusting amount here, but Chris, a sniper on the scene, had this to say, and keep in mind the apocalypse theme here. He said, "I got up out of Sierra 2, walked that 307 yards to the burning pile of embers, and it was a rain of paper that had burned, and it had floated up into the thermals of the heat. And there were individual pages of Bibles. It was raining Bible pages into these embers, and the embers were 1.6 million rounds of rifle ammo cooking off. So it's ammo popping up everywhere you go, and skulls everywhere, and half-burned bodies. I mean, and this is him talking, I mean, it was apocalyptic carnage. I don't know what hell looks like, but maybe that." He said, "I wanted to find some way to reconcile that a cow field in central Texas had become a fire that had killed 80 human beings and went back to being a cow field. And I wanted some kind of sense of how the hell that could happen. All I know is violence appears out of nowhere, destroys lives, and drifts to another scene. And I think I've just gotten over trying to figure out why." Think again, appears out of nowhere, right? Think about the behemoth and the Leviathan. When the apocalyptic imagery, the behemoth from, engorging on the reality, the current world, and wreaking havoc, Yes, that's all symbolical, but again, what we fail to make conscious will be enacted in the real world, and we will call it fate. He said it springs out of nowhere, destroys lives, and drifts off to another scene. This is part of that violent dialectic with God that we all are, so the theory goes. And just a lot of wild things about all these events. Timothy McVeigh, the orchestrator of the Oklahoma City bombing, was at Waco during these events. Is that crazy or what? Maybe poor use of the word there, but as a matter of fact, it was what happened to the Davidians, what he witnessed, the U.S. government and how they treated the Davidians and how it all ended up, was one of the primary motivations for why he ended up doing what he did. And what's even crazier is that the members of Heaven's Gate were watching the events of Waco on TV. You think Heaven's Gate like a cult. You don't think of a cult with TV, watching TV. It's a little tacky. And we'll get to that. But this was all late 90s and mid 90s. So my own theory is that given that we were approaching the millennium, that sort of the archetype of the apocalypse was boiling in the collective unconscious of all of us, of humanity. And certain people just end up letting it, certain people became possessed by it. It was too acute. That's just a theory, but it's a guess based on the theory we're talking about in this season. Moving on to Heaven's Gate, I had never heard of it until reading the Edinger book. And I don't think it's as well known as Waco. Or maybe that's just my own ignorance. The very TLDR of Heaven's Gate is it represents the largest recorded mass suicide on U.S. soil. They were a cult whose leaders they believed they were advanced alien beings trapped in human bodies and felt it was their purpose to bring as many humans into their next level alien consciousness. And they thought a UFO at some point would come and whisk them all away to this next level, to paradise, which is a place that physically existed in outer space. And it kind of reminds, it's got like Clark Ashton Smith, weird tales, occult, cosmic horror kind of thing to it. And eventually, it led to the mass suicide of 39 people. Edinger says, psychologically, this group, the Heaven's Gate group, expected and even hoped for the arrival of alien contents from the unconscious psyche, which would introduce them to the next level of psychological achievement. These 39 people said they committed suicide in March 1997 in order to ascend to heaven in the manner of a self-willed rapture, to escape the horrible end of the world. Nevertheless, the leaders of Heaven's Gate did believe that they would be martyred by the beast from the abyss, and wondered why the world paid them so little attention. The male leader, Marshall Applewhite, having waited 24 years for this outcome, considered provoking the powers of government, sound familiar? Similar to Waco, to bring it about, but chose instead the more introverted solution of suicide. This solution was also decidedly unbiblical, and death by one's own hand is not sanctioned by Christian theology. That was Edinger. Now, from the Heaven's Gate documentary, which you can find on HBO, it's from Benjamin, a religious scholar. He said, Heaven's Gate is a Christian offshoot, and this is important because this was a time where many Christians looked around at the world and believed it was going to end. Kind of goes back to my guess about the millennium approaching and Y2K and all that. But he goes, when people encountered Heaven's Gate, they didn't say, whoa, this is weird. They said, whoa, this is what I've been looking for. T and Do, the leaders, as they were named, they were the two witnesses. They claimed they were the two witnesses in the book of Revelation who would be martyred and then rise from the dead to lead people to outer space, to the kingdom of God. This is what they referred to as the demonstration. An undercover sociologist said the name of their process was human individual metamorphosis. Sounds similar to Neon Genesis Evangelion, the Human Instrumentality Project for anime fans. But anyway, that was Justin talking, not the undercover sociologist. Anyway, whereby each member is focused on their own overcoming, As long as there are attachments to the human kingdom that remain, you cannot be a next-level individual. Doe called it the cult of cults, the cult of truth. I think he was mentioned in the documentary, the male leader, as Doe as he calls himself, Marshall Applewhite. He said, people call us a cult. And he's like, I guess we're a cult. I mean, we're the cult of cults, the cult of truth, if you want to call us that. Basically trying to say we're just being real, ironically. The leaders called themselves the Two, or Bo and Peep, because they said they had sheep and they were the shepherd, or T and Doe, as in like the sound of music. Later, all three moniker, like T and Doe later, in the timeline, all three monikers refer to the same two individuals. And note the reference to the Book of Revelation. I mean, that's why we covered it, and this is all connected, I believe. So a few observations here. The two, just some strange things. They actually wrote a book called Heaven's Gate, in which all the rituals and information about the Heaven's Gate cult is articulated. Like I mentioned before, they're eerily modern for a cult. They had internet access to raise funds and stuff, and they had software engineers in their ranks. Crazy, huh? Like today they might have a Twitter or a Kickstarter or even like an IG. These days, it's strange to think about. What I found really odd and chillingly modern was that when they posted on the internet, they got really bad pushback. Even people telling them to go kill themselves. And to anyone who plays competitive online gaming, that is a creepily, eerily modern phrase, of which is thrown around just about every match. Those who know, know. But imagine, just telling that to Heaven's Gate is a little bit of irony there. Doe actually said that also the Borg were a good example of the ideal they envisioned from Star Trek, which probably not the best role models, but he did say that. Star Trek was approved media for the cult. Doe also said he would rather die in service to his message than live on this rotting world, and that remaining on the earth is the real suicide. They referred to this as graduation, never the term suicide. And the documentary closed on this. I think there are two lessons of the Heaven's Gate story. One is to not be judgmental. You know, everyone wants to think that, oh, those are the crazy people. I would never do that. Not so fast. But I suppose the most important lesson is to be careful. We tend to look for easy answers, and I think it's important to remember that nobody has all the answers. And once you turn that over to somebody, you put yourself at great risk, and that is so important because it talks about the archetype of the king. In my opinion, that's what the archetype of the king is. When you project, when you outsource your inner king onto some other entity that makes the kingly archetypal responsibilities for you, then they will rule you. You either rule yourself. We all have access to the king archetype. If we do not access it, we will project it, right? And that's a form of possession. Very last thing before we wrap up, a little tonal whiplash here, but Doe, I couldn't help but watching the Heaven's Gate documentary that I was thinking someone should contact Will Ferrell, because if he ever wanted to get into a dramatic or thriller kind of role, this would be the ideal role for him. And lo and behold, he actually was in an SNL skit where he parodied Doe. So, interesting thing. Anyway, that's all the time we have. Thanks for sticking with me. I got everything in. Please let me know in the comments how I did. Take care. See y'all next time.